All right, let's talk about the data submission now that the introduction and overview is over. All right, so we have this big piece of pie here. I get the first slice, the SENR, and that's because it provides ownership, right? If you're brand new, this is the one file that all the other files are dependent on. You have to establish your enrollments for your students in order to submit the other records for those students. So, there is some flexibility with eligibility programs and whatnot, but for the most part, the ownership period for your LEA revolves around the start and end dates in the enrollment record for the SSIDs you obtain. So, you must start with that enrollment. And then from your student information system, you're going to submit the student information or the demographics that's within that file type, the student English language acquisition for every student. If they are transferring student and already have a student English language acquisition record, you do not necessarily need to report a CELA for every student, but every student will have a status, regardless if it's EL, EO, what have you. The student program records for those students who are eligible for specific programs that are reported in Fall 1. There are other programs that are reported at end of year. And then your special education students, you're going to report the students with disabilities education plan type, meetings, and their services. All that's coming from Fall 1. So again, if you're brand new, that's a lot of information, I know. Essentially, those 6 file types that were on the previous slide will show up over and over throughout your reporting in CalPAD. So at the top, you see Fall 2. You can actually be submitting Fall 2 data now. CalPADs will accept it. But if you're brand new, you may want to wait until Fall 1 is finished. This is quite normal. You just have a shorter window. But those subgroups like the EL identification or your students with disability, and even your enrollment for your students are all used for Fall 2. So that the information you're submitting now is relevant in Fall 2. The same with end of year and end of year 2, and end of year 3, and end of year 4. So I don't want to go through every bubble, quite time consuming, but essentially the key point is that you're establishing your students' profiles for this year, Fall 1 submission, and in every submission cycle and every report going forward, just about, we will revisit that data. We will come back to it. All right, so if you did your prerequisite trainings, or if you're familiar with CalPAD, you know this flow pretty easy. But if you're brand new, we will cover it again quite quickly. Data gets into CalPADs, and it always starts locally, right? Either it's coming from your SED system or your SIS. SEDS being your special education data system, and your SIS being your student information system. The SSID is assigned by CalPADs. It's random and system generated. CalPADs assigns it, then you put it back into your local system. And then from that point forward, the student has an SSID, and all the subsequent files are identified to that student in the SSID. Data also comes into CalPADs from external systems outside of the local realm. You have TOMS, which is going to submit testing data for LPAC and CASP. And then you have statewide matching, both for foster youth. They're working on getting migrant matching in the future. And you have your direct certification to identify students eligible for free meals every month. That's the different sources of data input into CalPAD. Just a general summary of files. This is seen in the batch file demonstration, so we'll go real quick. Like I said, we start off with the enrollment file, and the enrollment file is used to obtain SSIDs, establish ownership of records in CalPADs, designates district or geographic residence, those students under transfers, identifies the transfer reason, and it's used to report no-show, identify dropouts, and also to resolve CCDs and ERD. Student information records are used to update that demographic information, right? Race, ethnicity, if a student should have a gender change in legal name or preferred name, residence, and mailing address are maintained in the student information. And it's necessary to identify students for direct certification and for testing. And then it also used to determine Title III eligible immigrants. And then for the federal definition of socioeconomically disadvantaged, the parent ed level is used. You have your student English language acquisition records. That's used to establish EL status for every student. It's also identifies student eligible for the initial LPAC. Although it comes from LPAC, students are identified for EL services with the EL designation in the SELA, or what's often referred to as the SELA record. And then again, the EL subgroup is one of the groups who qualify for LCFF funding. Within the record, there's a primary language, which is identified through the home language survey, the student's EL status, and then the status date. And then you have programs. So student programs identify students eligible for federal and state programs. The EL instruction strategies, or the LIT programs, have been now for the last 2 or 3 years. And then it also programs can help identify students for LCFF, like the Migrant or the Homeless program, some of the categorical programs that include a student eligibility in the LCFF. And then we have special education, both the special education or the SPED file and the student services, the SSRV. The special education records are used to identify a student's individualized plan, whether it be an IEP, ISP, IFSP. Also identify students have been evaluated or a pending evaluation, describes the student's program setting, and it also identifies the reasons or their eligibility through the primary and secondary disabilities. SSRV, the service record, identifies the prescribed services for a student's IEP. It also identifies the service provider details like the frequency and duration. And so with that, I get to take a break, and Kyron can drive this thing. Please direct all jokes in the chat to Kyron now. I'm off duty.
Thank you, Nate. So Nate discussed all of the data elements, the file types that are expected to be collected or submitted to CalPADS in compliance to all of those federal requirements that the state also needs to submit to the federal government, right? So those data, your SENR, SINF, SELA, SPRG, and of course your SPED and SSRV, are then aggregated and compiled into different subgroups, which is essential in meeting all of those program requirements for LCFF, for the SED identification, for other requirements that the state needs to collect from the LEAs. So those subgroups are collected from these file types, right? So all of these bubbles here are color-coded based on the sources, the type or file type that these are collected in or submitted with. So you have here the blue ones, which are student programs, GATE, Migrant Ed, Homeless, Tribal Foster Youth, SED, and then you have Foster Youth as well. All of these are basically collected through the SPRG and are aggregated and compiled into different. So GATE, Migrant Ed, Homeless, Tribal Foster Youth are part of your socioeconomically disadvantaged subgroup. It is indicated here. So we basically use the programs as well as state matching. You have your direct certification and foster youth matching. The enrollment, if a student is in a juvenile court school, or if the student's parent ed level is equal to 14, which is not a high school graduate, which comes from Student Information File or SINF. So there are two major subgroups that are identified in CalPADS. You have your socioeconomically disadvantaged, which includes these types, and the economically disadvantaged, which is basically another term for the or collection for the local control funding formula. So all of this parent level is part of the economically disadvantaged file or LCFF collection. So you have your EL, direct cert foster youth, student with disabilities, GATE, Migrant Ed, Homeless, Tribal Foster Youth, and Title III. So all of these are part of your LCFF. However, the SED, on the other hand, is the same except for the ELS. Okay, so that's just a basic differentiation of those two definition or subgroups. So again, foster youth and direct certification are state match. All other data elements are reported from your SIS and submitted to CalPEDS. Another subgroup is the free and reduced price meal subgroup. This is basically based on different eligibilities that the student might qualify for. So the ones in orange are based on income eligibility, and the ones on green are from other sources based on other program eligibilities. So let's start with the easiest one, which is the other sources first. So you have your homeless, migrant ed, and if a student is directly certified, and if a student is matched as foster youth, and if a student is determined as tribal foster youth, they automatically are qualify for free lunch. Okay, and so however, you really don't need to submit a 181 or 182 for them, since CalPEDS will automatically count them as long as you report their SPRG records for these eligibilities. Now, on the other hand, you have your income eligibility. This is based on the income eligibility form that you require your students to fill out every academic year at the start of the academic year, right? So if their parents' total income still qualify for free or reduced price lunch, then you submit a program 181 or 182 for them. Now, on the other hand, there is the CEP and Provision 2-3 schools. These are basically schools that meet a certain percentage threshold for low-income students. And so if they meet that threshold, they qualify for that flag as a CEP or Provision 2-3 schools. And as such, during the base year, Provision 2 and 3 schools are required to ask the students to fill out the forms. And then after that, subsequent years, you are barred from requesting the NSLP form be filled out, but instead fill out an income form. And that would basically be the form that you will ask those incoming students to fill out. Those students who are still enrolled and who qualify during the base year would still benefit from free lunch. Okay. So these are the sources. So once you determine those students based on income form or alternative form, you then submit a 181 or 182, and then CalPEDS then include those students in the FRPM meal subgroup. So the FRPM meal subgroup is just a subgroup on a bigger scale. So that comprises the LCFF subgroup, which we will discuss in a few minutes here. So the LCFF, as I've mentioned, is essentially the FRPM subgroup plus the ELAS students, EL students, and ADEL students. Okay, so you have your homeless, migrant ed, again, those income eligibility form sources, your foster youth, tribal foster youth, students who were directly certified, and then, of course, students who were identified as EL or who are ADEL in this current academic year up to census day, of course. So as Nate mentioned, our cutoff point is of census day, right? So majority of these records are included long as the student is enrolled, actively enrolled on or before census day and has any of these program records with a start date prior to or equal to census. So again, this first three is based on eligibility. So you submit the SPRG records, foster youth, and direct cert are state matched. And so you identify them based by run reports 5.7 or 5.9, and also by looking at the direct certification extract. Anyone who is directly certified between July 2nd to November 2nd are included on the LCFF subgroup. And then, of course, any student whose EL status is on or before 10/5/2022 are included. So anyone who are still EL this year from prior testing years and or students who just tested this year but and completed the test before 10/5 are included. Then, of course, you have your ADEL. These are your adult students who who should have been who are still EL, but since they can't test anymore because of their age, they are still eligible for funding. And so we made a new status, which is the ADEL, I think 2 years ago, to identify these students. So here are some nuances with regards to reporting NSLP eligibilities. This involves best practices with regards to who you should be reporting, what dates. And so I won't go through everything, but the only thing that you guys should know is that if a student was eligible last year and whose eligibility carried over to the new academic year because of that 30-day carryover, they shouldn't be reported with a 181 or 182 unless those students submitted a completion form for the income eligibility, depending on the status of that school. So if they are collecting NSLP, then you have to wait for the form to be submitted, completed, and then that's when you report the new SPRG. You shouldn't be reporting an SPRG record at least that is equal to the enrollment start date. Unless, of course, you've already sent out the forms during the summer and parents submitted the form during the first day of school, then maybe, just maybe, that might work. But most of the time, those forms normally come in later in August, September, or probably October. So we've mentioned the Provision 2, 3, and CPE schools. So this table here was updated based on Flash 202. So essentially, this is just saying that what is the practice of collecting meal applications, right? So again, for schools that are participating but not under any of these provisions, you have to or request income verification forms or NSLP applications on an annual basis. Okay, and then of course this is just option. The alternative income form is optional because you're already basically requesting students to submit the meal applications. Now for schools that are participating through CEP, you are barred from requesting meal applications. However, in succeeding years, you have to submit or at least submit income, require students to have the alternative income form collected for those incoming students who haven't been
Yeah.
verified to add into the collection.
Yeah. So for the CEP, you can't collect any NSLP applications because the community eligibility program is determined based on either directly certified students, right? And so when you have a high percentage of those students who have been directly certified, they're automatically have that recognition in CalPADS. The thing is for those other students, you have to identify that they're eligible, even if they're not directly certified students. So you have to submit alternative forms for students that weren't identified as directly cert, and then you're going to submit program records as well for those county applications because the state direct cert won't identify those who, if you're also running county DC, you have to submit a 181 and 182 form. So just keep that in mind as well. Although you're not collecting applications and although all the students are getting free meals, you want the funding. You have to identify these students in CalPADS for funding purposes. Also, we have that responsibility. I'm sure that if we don't do our due diligence and make sure that all the students who are eligible are identified and we get the federal funding for the free meals, California is not going to step in and pay for every meal. They just want to pay the difference. So keep that in mind with the data collection.
And so for 2 and 3, basically for the you should be collecting these meal applications to determine during the base year. Then after that, you just have to ask for the income alternative for those students who are new to the school during the subsequent years. Then, of course, those who are not participating in the SLP program, then you shouldn't be asking for applications for a meal program, but you are basically expected to collect alternative income forms just to be included in the unduplicated pupil count. Okay, so this table is just basically a matrix of how you report the start dates, how do you end date a program, and do you have to close each program every year. Okay. The takeaway here is that the only programs that CalPAS automatically closes every year is a free meal and reduced price meal program. So what does that mean? You shouldn't be submitting, when submitting SPRG records for 181 and 182 to CalPAS, you shouldn't be submitting a future end date to begin with, because CalPAS will automatically close the record once you exit the student during end of year, either with an E155, with an E150, or any student exit. CalPAS will automatically close your free and reduced meal program the next day. So you shouldn't be submitting future end dates. Okay? And your TK2, CalPAS closes that too at the end of the year for a TK program. All other programs are not auto-closed by CalPAS because the expectation is if the student is still at the same school and the eligibility still exists, then that program should be open until the eligibility is finished or the eligibility ceases to or the student doesn't participate anymore. Okay, regardless if the student leaves, sometimes if the student leaves, you can still leave your record open because you'll never know when the student comes back. That's just an expectation. However, it is optional for you guys. If you want to close it every year, then be it. It's fine with us as long as it doesn't overlap with any existing programs once the student comes back, or you use a start date that overlaps in old record. So for foster youth, how do you determine foster youth? Okay, the common misconception in CalPAS reporting is all students who are foster youth identified in California qualify for foster youth in the CalPAS collection. Unfortunately, that's not the case. There are only 4 subgroups of foster youth that are included in the foster youth collection. So you have your pre-placement, post-placement, permanent placement, for the transition, and voluntary placement. Actually, there's 5, I guess. So any student that meets or qualifies this tagging or classification will be included in the weekly CalPAS foster youth matching that is conducted between CalPAS and the CDSS database. Okay. So how do you identify this in CalPAS? You just run report 5.6 and 5.7 and even 5.8 and 5.9 to identify who who are the foster youth students and who are your actively enrolled students who were originally foster youth and are no longer foster youth, right? So just because a student is foster youth, that doesn't mean they are automatically determined as foster youth in the CalPAS realm. So for foster youth, we only identify those who are still foster youth on census day. So part of that is that the student should be enrolled directly in CalPAS with the student information. That way, once their data are sent up to the CDSS will be able to find that student and send back the student's classification in CalPAS. That's for the state matching. Now, there is also a local match that we conduct in CalPAS, and this is basically through online maintenance. So let's say you don't want to wait for the weekly foster youth, or let's say you expected the student to be foster youth, but CalPAS isn't reflecting that. You can potentially do the matching locally in CalPAS by going to online maintenance, local foster match, and make sure that you have the student's SS or any of this. If it's the case ID, then do the case ID, or if it's a client ID. Okay, so you can do a foster match, but the only matching that CalPAS will do would be based on the same subgroup of students that I've outlined earlier, which is based on this foster youth classification. Okay, so let me just do a short, a brief outline of all of the programs that are included in the LCFF and SED. That way, and the important requirements that you should be able to collect, right? So we have here your Title I Parsi Migrant. This is a 3-year program. The information that you need would be the migrant student ID, which you can determine by going to this website. Okay, so if you identify a student as migrant C, then of course you have to go here and determine the ID because that's a required field. Okay, for Title C Migrant, this is a 3-year program, and at the end of 3 years, you either have to close the program, but make sure the end date of that program is within your ownership period. That way, you don't encounter a GER 5. So we have a 3-year migrant program. This is a 3-year program, right? So it makes sense for you guys to exit the migrant program once a student ends their eligibility while you have the student enrolled at your district, right? The problem is there are times when the migrant ed renewal is during the summer, and that's in between enrollment dates, right? And so you lose ownership to send that exit date. So for those students who exited during summer for migrant and you think will be coming back next year, rather than using that exact 3-year end date, use the last day of school for the current academic year to exit the student. Or you could probably exit the student during the first day of school. As long as you have ownership during that end date, that's when you use that end date. Or the other option is just for CalPAS purposes, you could start and end date the migrant program every academic year, but then internally you should be tracking when the student's 3 years is due. Okay, that way in CalPAS you don't encounter SPRG 70s or GER 5s during the submission period. So that brings us back to this part here. Migrant Ed. No, this record should not be closed annually for returning students. For students exiting the school, these records may but are not required to be closed. Okay. So also you have the option to close the program every year, or close it during once the 3-year period expires. However, make sure it's within your ownership period. Moving on, homeless students. So there's always an emphasis from us to report any eligibilities as soon as you gather the information, and this most applies to homeless students because homeless students are basically they're always mobile, and also it could only be a 1-day homeless period or 2-day homeless period that you have to report. So I mean, you as soon as any program eligibility is available for you, regardless if it's collected in Fall 1 or end of year, report that in CalPAS. That way you are able to report the data to CalPAS and be have your students counted. So this is for homeless students, right? Homeless students are, this is in compliance to the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. We just want to know who your homeless students are based on different criterias, okay? If you know the homeless student, it could be a student who is an unaccompanied youth, a runaway, or maybe a student whose family is doubling up, a student who's in a shelter because of basically calamities like fires or hurricanes or all of those stuff. And then we have our gifted and talented students. So takeaway here, if the student is in the GATE program, you report them to CalPEDS. Now, if a student is participating in another district and moves to yours, that doesn't mean they qualify for automatically. You still have to test them for GATE, right? So it's just like an audition period. So as you can see here, this student is basically, yeah, genius. He's thinking outside of the box. But anyway, so for GATE, you have to report them to CalPEDS with a program 127. The program can roll over from one year to another as the student is still eligible. And then, of course, you have your TK program. So your TK program is basically to reflect those students who didn't make the cut to be 5 years old during a certain period. Okay, so if a student like mine a few years ago, whose birthday is in November, if the student didn't make the September 5 cutoff, then of course they are automatically counted as TK. They are still a TK kindergarten student. However, since their birthday doesn't make the cutoff of September 2nd up to December 2nd, then you put them in the TK program. Okay, any student whose birthday is between these dates are essentially considered TK. So they are still a KN grade level. However, the only way to differentiate them from your regular kindergarten is by submitting a program 185 record. Tribal foster youth. So the tribal foster youth is different from your regular foster youth. This is basically foster youth for students who are in Indian tribes and who is a dependent of a court of an Indian tribe or consortium of tribes or tribal organization who is a subject of a petition filed in the tribal court pursuant to tribal court's jurisdiction in accordance with the tribe's laws. Sorry for reading that. But yeah, this is different from your regular foster youth. So your regular foster youth comes from the CDSS. Tribal foster youth will come from your Indian tribe or consortium of tribes. So now, how do you identify this? So if you go to the CalPEDS user manual and then just type tribal foster youth. So we have here the definition and basically relevant resources like Flash 186, and of course guidance on how to gather information for foster youth collection. So let me just copy this and put it in the chat for you guys. LIP. So LIP programs are essentially language proficiency programs that our students are participating in. So normally this is for students who are EL, who require additional help throughout their EL existence. However, this is basically a program within the class. So it's basically the strategy that you use to provide additional language proficiency service in a class. So just because you have ELs, that doesn't mean these other students should not be reported, right? Any student who is in a class that is providing these programs can be reported in CalPEDS. So an EO student can be reported. However, just take note that 303 and 305 are specific to EL students. So you shouldn't be reporting 303 or 305 if the student is not an EL. Okay, so for the English learners, this is as of census day. So any student whose EL status date is on or before 10/5/2022 is part of this. Now, for those students who tested late and was TBD on census day, then of course they won't be included and recognized as EL learners in CalPAS for Fall 1. So the Title III eligible immigrant is basically a unique program because essentially this is not a program that you report using an SPRG record. It is derived from the information you report of the student in the student information file, your SINF. It's in the demographics. So essentially, if a student was not born in the US or Puerto Rico, and you flag the US schools, US less than 3 years indicator as yes, and if the student is ages 3 to 21, they are automatically counted as eligible immigrants. Now, the classic question always is that, okay, what if the student's parents are US citizens and they are working for the US Embassy or for the military in a country that is not part of this. So let's say Guam or let's say Saipan or Japan, but they're still US citizens, right? What would be, since they were born out of the US, the city of birth could be Yokohama or Okinawa or Guam, then of course they are automatically considered as foreign born, and if you flag them as yes here, they are automatically considered as Title III eligible immigrant. Okay, so for students with disabilities, so anyone with this educational plan type are included in the subgroup to be considered as student with disability. Okay, and then of course, only students with plan type 100, 150, and 200 are expected to be reported with an SSRV record, which reflects the services that are being provided for those students. So if your students are reported as SPED, then of course, they are included in the subgroup of students with disabilities. And part of the SPED reporting is, of course, the submission of their meeting types. So these are the meeting types that are expected for you guys to report in CalPADS. And then there are specific meeting types that does not require a service as well, which is basically pending and triennial meetings. Yes, Dana, foreign exchange students should be flagged as Title III. And then, do we enter 3 eligible immigrant programs, or does that come from the CalPAS extract? This is based on your SINF, the student information file. The student information file contains both the place of birth and the 3-year less than 3 years cumulative enrollment indicator. If you mark those yes, then the student is automatically counted as Title III eligible immigrant. You don't have to submit a program for that. Okay, let's go back to TK slides. What about the TK? Okay, I see. So now we have the TK, and of course we have additional the universal pre-K program and all of those new stuff that was introduced this year. Let's see here. So for TK kindergarten, so forth, we have here the different FAQs that you guys can go on to if you have additional questions on the TK. So there is essentially, where was that flash?
They talk about TK and flash 228 and 240. And the dates for this year is from September 2nd, February 2nd of 2023. I think on the slide you had December 2nd.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It's September.
We have.
Yeah.
So yeah, Sly was referring to, what was it again?
240. It's 228 and 240.
Okay. Okay. So we have here additional guidance on TKs. So for those who probably aren't aware, let me just put that in the chat box. Read that. Of course, I forgot to update my slide. My apologies. We will update the slide once the training is done. So again, for 2022-23, TK eligible is between September 5 to February 2nd. And then, of course, on 2024, it expands to September 2nd to April, and then September 2nd to June until 25. And then for after 4 years, 25-26, LAs are required to make TK available to all children who will have their 4th birthday by September 1st of the school year. Okay. Okay. So now one could either want to be a TK or a PS, I guess. So I don't know what CD would do with the preschoolers. But yeah, that's a guidance flash 228. Thank you for pointing that out, guys.